What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. I am glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite handguns ever. That is the 1851 Navy from Colt. I love the way these pistols look. I love the way they feel. I love the way they shoot. I love the history. Man, these are just some of the most fun guns to shoot, bar none. And definitely in my top 5, I would say. Now, before we jump into this video, I just want to say we're going to talk about a little bit of history in this video, but if you want deep dives, I'm going to leave that to the professionals. You must go watch the series from C & Arsenal on these guns. They have a wonderful 3 or 4 part series, several hours long, and man, they take you on a journey. It's inspiring. It's well done, and they tell you everything you want to know about the history of these guns. I really encourage you. Please go watch that. It's not just for the sake of learning the history, but it's going to give you a love and a fondness for these guns that maybe you wouldn't have had without it. So let's talk about what we've got on the table. I've got a pair of navies, and these are both manufactured by Uberti, but they are Colt 1851 navies, and they're both chambered in 36. This one here is my faithful London model, and really the only reason they call it a London model is because Colt had a factory in London to sell to the European market, and at the time, we were having a bit of an iron shortage in the country. Iron was expensive and hard to find, which is why you see brass appointments on a lot of the pistols from that day. Well, not only was Europe not having an iron shortage, they didn't like brass, from what I understand. And so the guns that came out of the London factory had iron back straps and trigger guards. And really, I would say this is what Sam Colt intended. I don't think he really ever wanted the brass on his guns. This seems to be truer to his intention, which is why I got one originally. But really, that's the only difference. This is sort of the one that we, I guess, would know of and be more familiar with the brass backstrap and trigger guard. The London model just has the iron trigger guard and backstrap. Now, today, these guns are made out of steel, much better quality steel. These guns are a much better build quality than the guns of that day. Now, the fitment, I would say, was probably better in that day. They seemed to know what they were doing a little bit better than what's being turned out modern day, but we'll talk about that. But as far as components, they wish they had this steel in that day. This is good stuff. It is much tougher than that iron. The iron can be a little bit soft. It corrodes really easily. It pits really easily. Modern steel is much, much better. As I said, these are Ubertis. I'm a massive Uberti fan. I've got 5 of these guns from Uberti, and actually I've got a 6th. Technically, it is my single action army. I just love the stuff they make. It is so historically accurate. In fact, you can take an original 1851 Navy from Colt in the 1850s and swap parts with an Uberti, and they will work most of the time. These guns are remarkably accurate to history. And so if you want a gun that's going to be the closest thing you can get to an original 1851 or any other model, Uberti is the best one doing it nowadays. Now, Pietta's great. I'm not hating on Pietta. A lot of people own them. I've owned them in the past. They're good guns. They work. However, they're just off dimensionally. The grips are kind of goofy and wide down here. They're chambered in things that you don't really see. Like a lot of 1851 Navies were chambered in 44. It's not something you really see. And then they also have a bunch of gaudy text all over the barrel, which I don't really like. Uberti does a much better job of hiding that text underneath your loading rod. So these are beautiful guns. They're very historically accurate. So if you want a Colt, this is the one to get. And just so you know, I say this in a lot of videos. A couple decades ago, when Colt was still producing these and selling them as Colt marked firearms, they were made by Uberti. So Uberti is the company if you want a historically accurate Colt pistol. So let's just do a quick brush up against history really quickly. So the reason I think the 1851 is a really significant pistol is because back in those days, you know, we're coming off the heels of everything being a single shot muzzle loading pistol, right? And everybody around that time, or a lot of companies, were trying to make a revolving pistol, and several did. But, you know, they were usually really expensive, or even if it was a good idea, they didn't have the manufacturing infrastructure behind it to produce enough of them so they were, specialized. You had a very small number of gunsmiths to make the guns, or maybe just the designs weren't as reliable or not as well thought out. And so there's a lot of models, not just from Colt, but other companies that led up to this. Really, I think the 1851 is the first pistol of its kind that accomplished a few things. First of all, it works. It's a reliable gun. It's intuitive. It makes sense. There's nothing goofy about it. It's just a well thought out and designed pistol that works. And second of all, this is really what put Colt on the map, is his genius regarding manufacturing infrastructure. He had a vision to not require a bunch of super specialized gunsmiths, which are hard to find, they're expensive to pay, and you really just limit yourself with how much you can produce when you go that route. He wanted a factory that produces these guns. And the intent there is you can hire a bunch of people, and each of those people are specialized in one thing. And as long as you have good systems, good templates in place, you can produce a lot of these guns at volume. So besides these being a good design that works, that was the other thing that really put a dent in time with the 1851 Navy, was Sam Colt's ability to turn these out consistently. And these things just took off. When the world got a hold of the 1851 Navy, we sold them to Russia, to England. We sold them, all over Europe. We sold them to Canada. In fact, that's why I have a London model, as I said earlier, because they opened a factory in London just to sell to the European market. And we sold these all over the world. They were extremely popular. Now, within short order, within a few years, new designs came along, but they springboarded off of this design. And I really think the 1851 Navy was significant in that regard. I also think the reason this was significant is they figured something out with this pistol in terms of size. So you have to understand the predecessor and some of the guns that came before this pistol were either really small pocket models or really huge, what they called horse pistols, namely the Dragoon. The Dragoon was enormous, and they called it a horse pistol because it was practically carried on a holster on a horse. They were just far too large for any one person to carry around comfortably all day. But then on the other side of the house, you had these pocket models that Colt produced, and they were very popular, but they were really small, often chambered in much smaller calibers. And long story short, Colt came up with this sort of intermediate size gun, which they called the belt pistol. And you can see here, these are some replicas of original cartridge boxes, and you can see what it's called there, revolving belt pistol. They called it that because it's a gun that you can actually carry on your belt. Imagine that. And so this gun also revolutionized the idea of the personal carry pistol. Now, a lot of people were armed back then, but what you tend to see is people were usually armed with a rifle, particularly something like a flintlock, maybe a percussion rifle. But for the most part, handguns were not ultra popular. This changed that, because not only do these things work, they're widely available, but man, they're accurate and they're effective. And if you're not sure about that, go look at the history and how many people have been switched off with designs of the 1851 Navy. It is an effective pistol. Namely, my favorite to bring up is Wild Bill Hickok. He carried two of these. Just go look at his history. He put a lot of people in the dirt with these 36 caliber revolvers. So to say they're not effective would deny history. So that's our brush against history. That's why I think they're significant. They really are just a part of American DNA. They're a part of our story, and I think they're an important gun in history. But they are functional in their own right, even to this day. So I'm going to set the London model aside, and we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty on the 1851 Navy. So this is chambered in 36 caliber. You got a 7.5-inch barrel. These guns are very unique compared to what we see today. So you have a sight notch on the hammer, your rear sight, and then you have a brass bead up front. The sight picture is something to get used to. It's not super intuitive, things we're used to today. But once you start shooting with it, for some reason, it just makes sense. And me personally, I'm able to deliver lead very easily with this pistol out to 50 yards, no problem, which you're going to see in this video. When I went out to the range a couple days ago with these, I was shooting at 45 yards standing, unsupported, hits all day long. So these guns are very balanced. They are nose heavy. The balance is really right at the forcing cone portion of the gun. Yeah, somewhere right there. So the gun feels a little nose heavy, but you want that. What I find with really short guns is they're too nose light, which makes it very hard to keep a steady sight picture. The nose of that gun wants to jump around and move a lot. But these guns that have some weight out front, which is why I like the full-size guns, they're very pointable, and when you're shooting long range particularly, they seem to just hold steady while you aim. You don't have a lot of nose wiggle. You have a very smooth action in all of these ubertis. Even though people argue with me in the comments about this, they're wrong. They're all 4-click Colts. These are not safety hammer Colts. Here, let me just prove it to you. 1, 2, 3, 4. That is a 4-click trigger. I don't know why. There's been a couple people like really vehemently fighting me about this, but guys, you just heard it. Those are 4 prominent clicks as you draw this hammer to the rear. So go and punch the air outside about it. I don't know what to tell you. So the action on these is buttery smooth, crisp triggers. You don't really want to dry fire these a lot, but I'm going to do it here just to show you. They are a very crisp trigger, and all the triggers on all ubertis. I've never felt one where it's like, oh, I wish that was better. Man, they're super consistent, very, very sweet triggers. Let's talk about shooting them. So a lot of people use loose powder, loose ball, and they load these guns that way. I have gotten away from that more and more, just because, especially if you're going to go woods walking with these, if you would just want to have this on your hip, I don't like the logistical operation for having to carry, a powder flask, a sack of ball, plus your primer, all the little tools that you kind of want to take anyway. You end up having to have like a whole bag just to support this pistol. I think there's a better way to do it. What I have gravitated towards is cartridges. Now, I bought these on Etsy. There is some great stuff on Etsy for these where people are 3D printing these boxes, and they come in these awesome historical replica cartridge boxes. But essentially, you just slide the cardboard off, and it's got a canvas hinge. You hinge that backward. Now, I put cotton in the top of the box here just so the cartridges don't slap around when you close it. They're held snug, and they don't slap around. Now, what's cool about this is you have 6 holes for your cartridges, but they also have added a little hole there for your caps. So I don't even need to carry a tin of caps. I've got everything I need right here to reload the gun. And these are conical bullets, which we'll talk about here in just a sec. And that's 15 grains of Pyrex P. I would say 90% of the shooting you're going to see in these videos is with cartridges. These guns work really well with cartridges, but as we'll talk about in a minute, the most important thing is you got to know how to load them. Just like with painting, if any of you guys have ever done any like fine painting work, preparation is everything, right? Smooth, even surface, good primer, no halfway wet drywall mud, all that stuff. Prep work is everything, and I think it's the same with loading these guns, and we'll get into that in just a minute. This is 3D printed plastic, so what's great about this is it seals very tight, so even if it's maybe really humid outside, maybe post-rain or something like that, I can literally throw this cartridge box in my pocket. I've got a reload for this gun. And if I really wanted to, I got 2, and yes, they are both loaded full of number 10 caps and paper cartridges. And really, on that note, some people might be like, man, you could carry more ammo. I don't think people thought that way back then, and I kind of know why now. And the reason is, these guns are not super high volume shooters. Now, again, I shot about 80 rounds through this one the other day, but guys, when you start getting these guns really dirty, every single shot, you are fighting a malfunction. You're fighting cap jams. It's extremely dry. All of your lubrication has turned to tar. The internals are seizing up. Black powder guns are just not high volume shooting guns. Even if you use like a better quality real black powder, they're just dirty. And so I think back then the way most people thought is basically you have what's loaded in the gun and one reload, maybe two. After that, the optimal function of the gun, it just starts to diminish after that. And now you're going to be fighting the thing in a very frustrating manner. I want the gun really clean, set up beautifully, loaded up. I'll shoot that one cylinder. I can retop it off with one reload. After that, I'm going to want to clean the gun. At least clean the cylinder, grease the arbor, clean the bore out, because that's the stuff that's going to start to fail first. Now, here's one drawback to the 1851 Navy. You can see here this little port that's cut out. That is for you to load ball into the chambers. You will notice in this video I'm going to show you, I was trying to load these conical bullets that I cast myself. It just doesn't work. The 1851 Navy in its original configuration is not set up for conicals. Now you see this in the 1861 Navy, the 1860 Army, where they have a much larger port cut out for conical, even cartridges, right? It's a much wider cutout. But as this gun sits, it's almost impossible to load conicals in this gun in its stock configuration. Now, what some people will do is they will take a Dremel and they'll hog that opening open. I'm not really into that. I don't want to do that. That just is riddled with risk. In my opinion, I think the best way to get around that is an alternative cartridge. Now, I shot a lot of these the other day out of my Navies, but essentially these are the same thing. They're just a paper cartridge, 15 grains of my powder, but there's a ball instead. These you can load up very quickly. You just twist them into the chamber, good to go. And these work with this standard port. Now, if you're going to stick with conicals, me personally, my cartridge boxes have conicals in them. Why is that? Well, the reason is if I had to reload this thing, I would not stick the cartridges down here. And I'll explain that in a second. But what I would do is I'd pull it to half cock, and I have a way of getting this wedge out where I can push down with my thumb to push this little notch out of the way, and then push the wedge free. Even when the gun's super dirty, I can get the wedge out very easily. So if it was me, I would literally now take the conical cartridges, stick them in. You can literally just push them down into the chambers. This is the part where a lot of people are going to go, no, you need a trim ring, right? And basically what they're talking about is when you stick your standard ball on these chambers, they don't fit. They're actually too big, and you want that so that when you pull your loading rod down, it trims a ring of lead off of that ball and seals it in that chamber very tight. That is good. However, the way these conical bullets are designed to operate, they actually fit, and I'm not going to put it all the way in there, but you can see I could slide this in there, no problem. It actually fits perfectly. But they're designed to be that way. The purpose for these is that they're a much softer lead, and when that explosion hits the back of these conical bullets, they expand and they stretch into the rifling and seal up really nicely in the rifling. And let me tell you, when you shoot these conicals, you can feel it. You go from standard ball and get the nice trim ring, seals up great, right? That's all good. But then you go to the conicals, the gun claps. It just poof. It has this more intense recoil, and the response, the report from the steel downrange, you can hear they are hitting harder. So, long way to say, I actually like to take the cylinder off of the gun, load in the conicals, and you can just push them all the way down with your thumb, as you'll see in the video, and throw the cylinder back on the gun, cap it, you're good to go. And if you go back to my setup video, this is one of the reasons I like a slightly loose fitting wedge. I don't like a wedge that gets stuck in there real bad, because I want to be able to take this thing apart by hand. And, you know, maybe I've got a jam, I've got to reload it, whatever the case may be. I want to be able to get this wedge out really easily. So my preferred is definitely conicals. They hit harder. They're much more accurate. At least I've felt that way. The ball is great. Nothing wrong with them. But if I'm carrying this thing in the woods and I actually want this thing to have some heat on it, I want the conicals for sure. These are my two sort of like, you know, functional cartridge boxes. And they have the nice little cap port drilled into them. But this here is actually a very legit reproduction of what you would have gone into a gun store and purchased if you wanted some paper cartridges. This one is actually sealed. This one does have paper cartridges in it. But if I wanted to get to these cartridges, I would have to do what they did back then, which is grab this string and you would tear it off, and the whole top of the paper would peel off, and then you could get to your cartridges. And this is waxed paper, and the purpose of this is waterproofing. Now, I'm not proofing. That's a little bit of a stretch, but you get the idea. Like, this was a way that you could carry your paper cartridges and maybe keep them free of some moisture, rain, whatever the case might be. I'm having a case made for a display case made for my 1851 Navy here, and this is going to go in there along with this really cool vintage reproduction Colt cap tin. If I can get the light to agree here. So this thing says, metal lined caps made expressly for Colt. Belt and pocket pistols. Manufacturers, London. How cool is that? And I actually put a bunch of number 10 caps in there. So that's the way I carry this thing. I carry it loaded, and then I carry a couple of conical cartridge boxes. I just think that's the best way to do it. Carrying loose materials is just annoying. And really, that means what I'm walking out with is this pistol in a belt, these in a pocket or a bag, whatever the case may be. I don't have to carry a bunch of stuff. Some people might say, well, yeah, you might break a cartridge and lose powder, or yeah, you might lose caps. That's why I would carry two. Not that I think I'm actually going to burn up two cartridge boxes. It's more like one's a reload, one's a spare for my, when stuff goes wrong. So that's something to be aware of there. Conicals do work in this gun. They're just going to be a real pain to try to load when it's assembled. It's probably going to be something you want to load with the cylinder out of the gun. Now, if you really want to stick with something that's going to take conicals without having to do that, you're going to want to go to the 1861 Navy, which is a fantastic gun in its own right, but I kind of just prefer the 51. So shooting. These guns shoot great, man. The recoil is minimal. Again, with the 15 grains of powder and the conicals, it does, thump a little harder, and you can hear it downrange. But even then, it's not even like a 380 or a 9mm. They're very minimal recoiling pistols. They're very accurate. Again, from some of the videos you're going to hear played in the background, I'm getting hits all day at 45 yards. And the reason I went to 45 yards is that's actually like a fun challenge. If I was within 10 yards with this pistol, I would not miss the whole day. And frankly, it's just kind of boring. Like, it's nice, but I actually want to challenge myself and stretch myself with the accuracy on these guns, because the guns will do it. The question is me. Now, something else you should be aware of with these guns is they are zeroed a little different. So to get hits at 45 yards, I am aiming about a foot low on a man-sized silhouette to hit in the chest. These things are zeroed for a bit of a longer range. Some people, they will go and like file down sights and try to change that and all that good stuff. I don't really care about that. I just, I know how to do the Kentucky elevation, so to speak. But you should just be aware, if you were going to go and try to shoot at 45 yards, for instance, you're going to wonder why you're not hitting when you're aiming center mass. And that's because you're shooting clear over the top of that target. And that is true on all my Colts. My other 1851, the London, my 1861 Navy, my 1860 Army, that is just how they are. They shoot high, but I think the reason is they're zeroed for like 100 yards. They're meant to be shot long range if needed. Now, there's not much to say about disassembly and cleaning these because it's pretty much like all other Colt open-top revolvers. Suffice it to say, cleaning these guns sucks. There's no way around it. There's no shortcuts. The shortest cut there is, I have found, is you're going to want hot running water, get some Dawn dish soap, nylon brushes. That's the fastest path to getting these guns clean. But one thing you don't want to do is shoot these guns, do a quick down and dirty cleaning, and then throw them in the safe and forget about them, because you're going to open them up in a few weeks and be very sad. So when you're done shooting these, maybe after a couple days, if you're shooting a lot over a few days, you do want to do a detailed strip, and you need to clean every single spring and screw, everything inside and out. That's the right way to take care of these guns. Now, for a quick field cleaning, and I did this when I was out there the other day, there's 3 main components that start to get dirty really, really fast. And I'm going to take apart the London here to show you. First of all is your bore. You can fire 2 shots and then look down your bore, and it's going to look like you're looking at like a 40-year-old sewage pipe. These things get dirty extremely, extremely quickly. The next thing is the cylinder, and it is really the epicenter of all things dirt. These things get dirty extremely quickly. They're basically managing a bunch of explosions with very dirty powder. And then the other one is going to be the arbor in this area here where the primers are getting ignited. Now let's talk about the arbor first. About every 2 or 3 cylinders, I personally take off the cylinder and re-grease it with bore butter. I want to stay ahead of that problem. But what's going to start to happen is that grease you're adding and adding and adding is going to start to compound. And once you get to about 6 or 7 cylinders deep, now you just have a giant black sludge slime ball that has conglomerated all over your pistol. And at that point, it's time to use your hot water and clean that arbor off. The story is the same with the cylinder. You're going to start to get your nipples completely clogged up with primer soot. The chambers are going to probably be full of, half-burned paper. If you're using paper cartridges like I do, they're going to be full of soot as well. And the same with your barrel. So when you get through about 5 to 7 cylinders, if you want to do a quick field cleaning, it's really easy. You take some hot water, angle the gun down. You don't want to pour hot water down into the internals of your gun. I mean, it's not going to hurt it, but what you don't want to do is take all that sludge and that blackness and just pour it into your action, okay? So the action should be, pretty well fortified against anything. Now, if you want to, you can just do a flush, but I don't really like that idea because now you're going to shoot it again. That water is going to evaporate. Now it's going to be super, super dry. So me personally, I would rather have dirty lubrication in the action than just plain dry dirt. So I angle it down and I just let the water pour on the arbor. If I can, I'll put a piece of plastic under the arbor just so it doesn't go down where the bolt is there, and clean the arbor off completely. Get rid of all that, gunk, that tar that you've built up. The next thing is the cylinder. Same thing. I'm actually, if I've got like a cup or a tin, I'm going to submerge my cylinder in that hot water and scrub it out with a nylon brush. Scrub it as much as I can and get all of that stuff out of there. And then the bore, very similar story. Just going to pour hot water right down the bore, maybe run a patch through it. After that, dry everything off as best you can. Dry patches, maybe a tiny sheen of bore butter on a patch just to go behind it, because these will rust within seconds. You'll watch it happen before your eyes, especially when they get hot. But you want to make sure everything's nice and dry, or your next shot is going to be very sad, because water and powder don't mix. You're going to re-grease your arbor. You're going to stick your cylinder back on there, and you should be good to go for probably another 5 or 6 cylinders. Now, everybody's different. They have different experiences, different tips and tricks, but the most I've shot out of this pistol, my London model, in one day was about 140 rounds, maybe more. And I stopped because I ran out of ammo, not because the gun seized. The gun kept working. I took it apart, gave it a quick field clean, arbor, cylinder, and bore, and just kept going. Now, the next tip I'm going to recommend is about every other cylinder, you're going to want to make sure that you grease the front of your rounds. So when the gun is loaded, you've got your ball in there or your conical bullets. You're just going to shoot some bore butter down on top of each of those. And the idea behind that is every time you fire for that cylinder, you are wetting and greasing and lubing that bore. And then you can run a patch down the bore real quick, and all that soot's going to be nice and wet and should come out pretty easily. But what you don't want is dry burned powder on top of dry burned powder on top of dry burned powder. That is where the gun will just absolutely seize completely. Another thing, while you're greasing the gun and greasing the front here, the face of your cylinder, it's good to just wet the face of the cylinder with bore butter and do like this. Literally put some on your finger and turn it, because your forcing cone is going to have a collection a few thousandth thick of soot and burned powder on the tip of the forcing cone, and it's going to be rubbing on the also dirty face of the cylinder, and you're going to start to seize up. But if you can keep that wet about every other cylinder, you're going to head that off. So the name of the game here with keeping these guns running is not clean them after they're dirty. It's maintaining as you fire to stay ahead of them getting too dirty. Because if they reach the point where you have just absolutely caked the gun up and it's bone dry and dirty, well, now you have a very hard problem, because you can actually seize the action. The gun becomes very difficult to get apart. Your cleaning is elongated and painful. It's just not good for the gun to do that. So make sure as you're shooting, keep the gun lubricated. If you got to take it apart and do a field cleaning and re-lube it, do it. The loading procedure, I cannot overstate this, is so important for the sake of accuracy, reliability, velocity, everything. The best performance you're going to get out of this pistol is by your loading procedure. So as I've already said, I prefer these conical bullets. I just love the way these things shoot. They're very accurate and they hit a little bit harder than the ball just because they're softer, and as I said, they expand when they get shot, and they fill the rifling up really nicely, and you have a much nicer sealed cartridge. But whether you're using conical or ball, this is so important. First of all, when you load your powder or your cartridge, make sure the cylinder is dry. Don't oil up your cylinders and then go out to shoot. It's very unlikely you're going to get ignition. The powder is very dry. It's absorbent. In the smallest amount of moisture, it's going to grab onto. Now, you can tell if you've maybe just done a very small sheen of oil or bore butter in the cylinders as a maintenance to keep those things, just slightly lubricated for storage. You'll see some powder stick to the walls. That's okay, but you don't want big, thick pockets of lubrication, because the powder is just going to grab onto those. It's going to cake up, and it's going to be rendered useless. And then you're going to have the fun experience of having to knock a ball out of one of your cylinders because the powder is wet. The next is make sure that the nipples are clean. Specifically, take your cylinder off, and let's just do that right now. We're going to take the cylinder off, and I'm actually going to visualize each of these nipple ports, and I want to make sure that I can see light through there. That tiny little pinhole, hopefully you guys can see through there. You see the white behind, right? You want to make sure that you've got daylight looking through there. If those are 1% clogged up, rest assured they're going to get clogged up really fast when you fire. So make sure that those are clean. Again, make sure your arbor is greased. These grooves on the arbor here are there to collect and store grease so that it's not just a smooth bore pole. When you slide the cylinder on, all the grease is pushed to the rear of the weapon. Specifically, this little area right here. You can see the front of the arbor is sort of bigger, and then it reduces in diameter, and then it has this little neck before you get to the ribs on the rest of the arbor. This little section right here is right underneath the forcing cone, and what you're going to find is when you fire, this area right here is going to get that burned up soot first. And this is going to be the pathway to the gun drying out. So when you lubricate this thing up, you can see I've got a big glob on this area right here. Make sure that area is really properly lubricated, because what you don't want to have happen is as you're trying to work the action, you're fighting over a dry arbor. You might think I'm talking about cleaning. No, this is about loading. It's really important all this stuff is in place for when you load the pistol. Also, make sure that at half cock your cylinder is spinning freely. There's nothing hanging up. Okay, you should not be fighting the pistol to cock the hammer. It should be nice and easy. Now, once you pour the powder in or load your cartridge, this part's really important. Black powder wants to be compressed. So when you're going to load, pull down on your loading rod, you're going to start to come in contact with your ball or conical. You want to push down, but don't just push and kind of go, okay, that's snug enough. No, you need to push until it stops and then give it another little oomph. Compressing that black powder is really important to get good ignition and good velocity out of your cartridges. Particularly, I would say, if you're using conicals, you need good ignition to make sure that these things expand into the rifling and do their job properly. Now, what some people will do if they're going to load up to sort of just go woods walking, make sure the gun's loaded up well, they won't use a cartridge. They'll use powder, maybe some sort of a filler or a wad, which I have. Now, the only thing is a lot of those wads are pre-lubricated. So in my opinion, I don't think it's a good idea to use a lubricated wad on top of powder and then your ball on top of that, because that lubrication is going to seep into the powder and it's going to disable the top layer of that powder. What I think is a better idea is to use a dry wad if you're going to do a long-term load to walk around with. So you do your powder, you'll put your wad on there, you'll set your ball on top, mash it down nice and firm. And then what I would recommend is some sort of a sealer or a lubrication. Again, I keep talking about it, bore butter. I would put bore butter down on top of each chamber. You don't have to fill it all the way up and put too much, but just enough to sort of go down there and fill around the perimeter of that ball or bullet. What this does is twofold. One, when you fire, like I said earlier, it's going to lubricate that shot and keep the bore nice and smooth for the next one. But the second thing is it's going to keep your powder safe. Let's say that old phrase, keep your powder dry, means something. So having that bore butter or grease or whatever you're going to use sealing up around that bullet, making sure nothing can get through, really important. Now let's talk about caps. So here's the thing with caps. These pistols call for number 10 caps, and that is what I have here in this fancy old school cap tin. So if you just hold up a number 10 cap versus a number 11 cap, they look identical. They're very, very close. But the number 11 cap is slightly larger. For a woods walking load, if I'm just going to have this thing loaded and on my hip with maybe a couple spare reloads, I'm going to carry number 10s. But here's the problem. Number 10s fit extremely snug on the nipples of these pistols. So what you're going to find is as you shoot throughout the day, if you're just having a range day and you're trying to shoot more volume, I actually recommend you bring number 11s. And the reason is the 10s get so snug and really impossible to push down on that nipple when the nipples start getting dirty from a lot of firing. They just don't work really well. So when the gun starts to get dirty, I switch to 11s. And what you can do is when you go to put them on, you put a little pinch in the cap to sort of just pinch it closed so that it has some grab onto that nipple. They work pretty well. The problem you're going to start seeing, though, with 11s, cap jams. And this is what we got to talk about next. Cap jams, unfortunately, are the bane of the open-top Colt's existence. It is a very frustrating thing. And you're going to see in the video, you can tell how far along in the day I am by how many cap jams I'm having and how many struggle sessions I'm having with these guns. So what starts to happen is not only does the action get really difficult to work with as you start shooting and getting the gun really dirty, but when you switch to 11s, what starts to happen is that cap, because it's not nice and snug on the nipple, the hammer drops, hits the cap, and you have this explosion go off, and the hammer actually kicks back off of the chamber a little bit and allows the cap to pop off or fragment, and now you have pieces that will fall down here into this channel and keep the hammer from fully going forward on the next shot. You'll get it down behind the cylinder and it'll jam up the action near the hand, Worst case scenario, you have one drop down here into the action through this little port in the hammer, and the gun will be rendered completely inoperable, and you got to take it apart. Cap jams are a real problem. The best way around that is to use a properly sized cap. But again, the problem is the 10s get really frustrating to get on there as the gun gets dirtier. A way around this is, one, making sure that you have a really good, strong hammer spring. You can buy an extra power hammer spring if you want, or you can take your hammer spring out and put a little bit more of a bend in it, and that will help making sure that when the hammer falls, it stays forward. It doesn't boom and bounce off when it fires, because that bounce back is a problem. But another thing is when you load. So you fire, and when you load, you point the pistol straight up in the air and you cock the pistol, and that allows the cap to fall away from the gun, versus if you cock the gun pointed forward, it wants to fall into the gun. Now, everything I just told you is not unique to the 51 Navy. That really can be said about the 1860 Army, the 61 Navy, any of these other percussion guns, minus the 1858 Remington. If you haven't watched my video on that one, go watch it. If you want to bypass a lot of these problems I'm talking about with reliability and cap jams and the gun seizing, the Remington 1858 is much more forgiving with all these problems, especially cap jams. That gun pretty much never has cap jams ever. It's a much better design in that regard. That is a good brief overview of the 51 Navy. Some of the things that I've learned, how to keep these things running, how to best set them up for success. Overall, I will say I have the utmost of confidence in these guns. I have strapped them on my hip many a time to go out to the range and enjoy myself. And man, just as a backup gun, a woods walking gun, absolutely. Especially when they're clean. That first cylinder, they run great. They're effective. You can use them at range. And, I trust them. They're great guns. But everything I've just said is just a brief overview of some of the things you got to watch out for and understand how to keep these things running. Now, a lot of people sort of get into like load development with these guns. Like Blackie Thomas has some great videos on that. I've never gotten into that. I've always felt like, for him, he's really going after like, rabbit hunting with some of these guns. And he wants a small group. He wants small group accuracy. For me, I'm hitting man-sized targets at 45 yards. I'm good. So I've never really felt the need to deviate from this sort of standard 15 grains that I have in my powder flask. But I will say, if you want to play around with your load development, different size ball, different patching, different powders, different loads, man, you can really tune these things in, especially your gun, because they're all a little different. You can tune these things in to get really accurate. But that's the video, guys. That is the Colt 1851 Navy. I love these guns. They are just an absolute joy to shoot, and they are very effective, reliable guns if you know how to keep them running. So hope you guys enjoyed that. I would love to know, man, how many black powder shooters are out there in my audience? I know there's a few. There's not as many as 1911 guys, it seems. You got to give these guns a chance. I'm going to acknowledge right out of the gate, they are very frustrating if you're new to them, because it's like, holy crap, these guns suck. They don't work. And then you clean them for the first time and you're like, I never want to do this again. But like all things, you learn tricks, you get more proficient, and you start to make things a lot quicker and easier, and you do end up getting some good reliability out of these guns. So give them a chance. I'd recommend it. And here's the best part. These guns, I have got every single one on sale on Midway USA for like $350. That's a beautiful pistol for that price. I mean, that's really hard to beat. Anyway, guys, I love these guns. They're fantastic to shoot. They're a joy to throw on your hip and go out and have fun with. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. Hope you learned something. I hope it was helpful. And I want to hear from you. Which of you are out there running some Colt 51 Navies? All right, guys, until the next time, we'll see ya.